I'm Ed Ziubrzynski, and this is SEO in 2025.
Ed, what's your number one SEO tip for 2025?
For 2025, my tip is Global EEAT needs to be a local strategy. This is going to be covering things around actionable steps of how you can implement EAT across multiple markets and how you can specifically dive into the locality, such as compliance in certain areas, how emojis mean different things around the world and how that can impact your content, and also how you can make your content work its hardest for you across all the markets that you work in.
So why does EAT have to be a local strategy, or should it be a local strategy? And what are a few steps that you recommend in order to make it happen?
With EAT in general, I always prioritize the trust element. And in this case, the trust element actually becomes compliance. When you think of, say, in the UK, we have GDPR. In the US, you have the Californian Protection Act. In South Africa, you have the POPI Act. All of these things essentially mean the same thing. However, you have to make sure that that information is front and center and available on your website. Obviously localized for each market, as they each have their own jurisdictions, legislations, rulings, and things like that. So the first area that I like to look at is the compliance side of things and making sure that you have these pages present and prevalent on your website. Again, it's okay to use sort of existing content as it will be largely similar, but you really need to localize it for that audience. As well, if you have anything related to local VAT registrations or any tax sort of codings that you need to have present on your website, make sure to include those in your website's footer, especially on the alternative markets. Having your business registration details, having these GDPR, POPI Act, any kind of ruling like that present, and also just making sure that you have any kind of partnerships with local bodies, governing bodies, industrial bodies. Again, surfacing that information so that the user can see that trust element because you are affiliated with all of these industries or regulatory bodies, but also you streamlining that information and making it much more accessible so that when somebody lands on your website, they're seeing content that is relevant to them in their respective geolocation instead of just generalized content that you could, in theory, roll out across the board, but it almost becomes that jack of all trades, master of none, because you're not making content that is hyper relevant for the audience that you're targeting at that time.
Interesting. So this compliance, this adherence to local laws and ensuring that they're mentioned on your website isn't just about making sure that you're legally compliant. It's actually something that search engines will crawl and be more comfortable to trust your website because of it. And so is there actually a measurable impact that you've managed to define as a result of this?
In terms of direct measurement, I think the continuous growth and also even just maintenance of your organic visibility is this kind of metric that you can't really measure unless you go into the whole sort of share of search side of things. But what it does do is it future-proofs your strategy, and it also creates that longevity because you're satisfying all of these metrics, and also you're producing content that, as you say, users will feel safe reading, but then also search engines, when they're crawling your website and crawling your competitors, it can pick out the common themes of all the websites that rank prevalently in this geolocation have this level of content on them. So it's almost a case of you're satisfying a minimum requirement and also legal compliance all in one. That's not to say that this won't directly impact your ranking, because ultimately, if two websites start on the same day, one has all of this additional information, all of these regulations ticked, and another website doesn't, the likelihood is that the website that does have it will overtake that one or be picked up in search results far quicker. But that, again, is just because it satisfies that EAT requirement and also the legal sort of compliance thing as well, thus making it a more trustworthy website, which gives you that step up on competitors in the short term, especially.
Is there an relatively easy way to ensure that you are legally compliant globally with information like this on your website? Because if you're a global company, there could be 100 plus different jurisdictions that you operate in, and you want to make sure that everything's on there, but also everything's up to date as well. So I'm just wondering if there's some kind of service that could actually ensure that everything's up to date on your behalf and automatically publish it on your website.
So realistically, I like to do this quite manually, as then it gives me total control over all of these different areas of the content. Something that I do find that works very well in these instances is, I mean, being someone that is so passionate about EEAT anyway, I always think that the About Us page is one of the most crucial pages on your website. Making sure that you surface all the content there laid out perfectly, saying that these are the bodies that you're part of, these are how you comply with these regulatory bodies, even having like policy pages such as things like the privacy policy, if you're an e-commerce store, having like your shippings and returns policies, how they can differ by location, and then also including in your website footer for that respective market, whether it's in a subfolder structure or if you have a totally separate domain for the additional markets that you're in. Just making sure that that content is there listed. When it's things like, say, your VAT registration and your company registration, that shouldn't change, but it's just a case of, same with all SEO content as well, just making sure that you frequently review, update it as and when required, but also making sure that that content is surfaced in the first place and is readily available for users and search engines to see.
Something else that I recall you mentioning in your opening remark is the use of emojis. What's that got to do with EAT?
So emojis can be used quite conversationally, and dependent on the industry that you're in, you'll find that some may use them a lot more. Working in fintech, for instance, I tend to use things like the cash emojis, the money bag emojis, things like that, as we know that studies have been conducted when you see an emoji in a meta title or description, it can influence a higher click-through rate just because of the differentiation on the search engine results page. Is when you think of all the just blue organic listings and then you see something that's got a pop of color or something a little bit different, is naturally eye-catching. What's interesting to note is how these things can mean different things in different locations. So for instance, the OK hand sign is something that we know over here is to just be like, okay, that's fine. Whereas in places like Brazil, that's actually deemed quite an insult. So making sure that you tailor your content and not just sort of blanket rollout and reuse content as standard in all markets, with emojis being a key focus, is just the way that, again, you're surfacing content that is relevant and also appropriate for that audience. Emojis themselves may not seem like such a large factor, but it's something that if it's something that your business are using and rely on in communications, making sure that it's tailored for the market that you're in and appropriate for that user base is an EAT requirement, in the sense of it shows that you're, again, trustworthy in the sense that you're giving content that people can use and rely on. It also shows your authority in the space as well, in the geolocation, as you're, again, serving reliable content that's suitable for that audience.
And you mentioned at the beginning there that emojis and perhaps a page title might actually positively influence click-through rate as well. Because of that, are you actually potentially seeing an increase in trust?
I would say so, as ultimately when your website is getting engaged with more, I believe it's Rand Fiskin ran a bit of an experiment with this, where having his result clicked multiple times in a short space of time actually promoted his result by a place within the same day. So I think it moved from position 2 to position 1. Anything that can be used to influence click-through rate, and then also having that relevant and suitable content that's appropriate for your audience on your website that they then further engage with, signals that that content is highly authoritative. You can be seen as an expert dependent on what the bibs of that page is, which also shows your authority and ultimately the trustworthiness that can be attributed to your website as a whole.
I mean, it almost seems like a minefield to roll this out globally. Perhaps it means that content needs to have an individual country strategy instead of actually tweaking aspects of what you've got already and potentially upsetting someone.
What's quite nice in this aspect is that you can make your content work as hard as possible for you. By that, I mean, we obviously are in fintech. So a lot of the funding products that people will use are the business finance products, I should say, are ultimately the same, whatever the location. It ultimately boils down to generic business funding, so debt financing, equity where you give away part of your business for the investment, business grants that are obviously free cash, and things like commercial mortgages or equipment financing. They're the same core products, but the way that you go about them may be different different in certain locations. So the required documentation, the business and personal credit scores. So in the US, you need a personal credit score of, say, over 500 to really be eligible for certain things. Although that seems like quite a big part of the content, realistically, that's only actually a small tweak that you need to make when you actually put that landing page together. So it's perfectly fine to use the content that you've already got, make it relevant for the audience, and then have a local expert review it. And the reason that you do that as well is, say, if you've paid £500 for a singular piece of content, if you're operating in 10 markets, you can make that content stretch across those 10 markets, but you just have to really drill down on the focus and the geo specifics for each market within that piece of content. So instead of 10 unique pieces, you have one piece of content that has been used and edited 10 times and made relevant for a market. This allows you to reduce the cost of your overall content production, speed up the content production process, and also scale up the content that you put out, as, again, it's a lot easier to get 20 pieces of content written per month than it is 200 for all the respective markets that you have.
You mentioned that trust is where you tend to start off with when establishing your EAT performance for different websites. What's the second area that you tend to focus on?
That would be the expertise side of things then. So that would be the criteria that we have for our writers. Again, we have things like editorial policies as well that users and search engines can crawl to understand what the process is for content being produced, how we essentially verify its accuracy, how regularly we review it to ensure that we're serving the best and most relevant content at all times with a high level of accuracy. So that is sourcing either writers that have a lot of experience within your niche, or best case scenario, a lot of experience within your niche in that specific market. In the cases like we were discussing, just where you may not necessarily have a writer available that has the expertise within that market, the way that you then look at it is you produce the content from someone that is an authority and an expert within the industry as a whole, so business finance, for instance. And then you have a local expert. This could be a member of your organization within, say, like the sales team, could even be like your head of that market, or you actually use a freelancer that is an expert within that field to basically review and verify that information. And again, it's fine to have multiple authors, multiple contributors, having little taglines saying that this content was written by expert A and was reviewed by expert B to ensure factual accuracy. And things like that. So really displaying that expertise, again, makes a more trustworthy piece. And if you're trustworthy and demonstrating expertise, again, with first-hand experience as well, where possible, you ultimately become that authority within the industry. So it very much is a Venn diagram of all these elements overlap to produce that one perfect piece of content that is suitable for that audience. But that's the way that ultimately you can use this Global EEAT strategy to further your SEO strategy and ultimately provide longevity for your campaign.
And how do you measure the degree of expertise that someone has?
Ultimately, searching for the author themselves on Google, seeing what kind of information you can surface immediately in terms of where have they been featured, are they consistently talking about this topic? As you may have someone that, again, has a lot of experience across a variety of topics, but then when you start to really dive into their sort of profile themselves, it's how much are they actually talking about the topics that you're surfacing on your website. So again, I say jack of all trades, master of none. You really want that person that their whole profile is dedicated to one or two particular areas. And again, using the experts that you have firsthand available within your organization. Obviously, if you've got a dedicated content writer or content team internally, fantastic, as they will have first-hand experience writing this content within this industry. If you rely on external experts or external content production, then making sure that you verify that information and also use the people that are available to you, whether it could even be like your CEOs, your head of marketing, anything like that, that really has the industry experience to basically say, yes, this content is trustworthy and this is why.
If an SEO is struggling for time, what should they stop doing right now so they can spend more time focusing on local EAT in 2025?
Instead of focusing on publishing hundreds of pages that are unique each time, really making sure that you publish a smaller quantity of pages that are at a higher quantity that can then be repurposed globally. Again, one piece of content written can be used 5 to 10 times realistically, depending on how many markets you're in. Doing that and focusing on localization as opposed to complete overhauls of content means that you get a high level of output for a much smaller input. And again, when it comes to things such as SEO reporting on ROI, if one piece of content is used globally and it results in leads, then every sort of bit of revenue that piece has generated is actually coming from one article that's just been repurposed and had man hours spent on it, as opposed to high levels of investment and then also high levels of work in the sense of publishing, reviewing, and doing it on a unique basis per market itself.
Ed Ziubrzynski is Global SEO and Content Manager at Swoop Funding, and you can find him over at swoopfunding.com. Ed, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2025.
Thank you, David.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2025, the book, over at SEOin2025.com.